Picture this. It's 1519, and Hernan Cortés has just accomplished what many thought impossible. He's conquered the mighty Aztec Empire. But here's the thing that's often overlooked in the history books. Cortés didn't just bring conquistadors and disease to the New World. Hidden among his supplies, almost as an afterthought, were 16 head of Spanish fighting bulls, 16 animals that would fundamentally reshape an entire continent. Now, when I say fighting bulls, I want you to understand what we're talking about here. These weren't your docile dairy cows. These were descendants of the wild aurochs that once terrorized European forests, massive, aggressive beasts, bred for centuries to charge headlong into anything that moved. Imagine creatures weighing over 1,000 pounds, with horns like spears and temperaments that made grizzly bears look friendly. That's what Cortés unleashed on Mexican soil. The multiplication rate was staggering. Within 50 years, those 60 years, those 16 animals had become millions. Millions of wild cattle roaming freely across New Spain, from the coastal plains of Veracruz to the mountain valleys of Michoacán. And here's where the Spanish colonial system ran into a problem that threatened their entire enterprise. You see, the Spanish had conquered an empire, but they had no idea how to manage these cattle. European methods simply didn't work in this vast, untamed landscape. Spanish vaqueros, MLE, the few who made the journey across the Atlantic, found themselves completely overwhelmed. The cattle were too wild, the terrain too varied, and the sheer scale too massive for traditional European herding techniques. The solution came from the most unexpected source imaginable, the very people the Spanish had conquered. The indigenous peoples of Mexico, particularly the Aztec descendants in the Central Valleys, possessed something the Spanish desperately needed but didn't initially recognize: an intimate understanding of the land that stretched back thousands of years. These were people who had domesticated turkeys and dogs, who had created floating gardens on lakes, who understood animal behavior in ways that would impress modern zoologists. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. They took to Spanish horses with what can only be described as supernatural speed. We're talking about people who had never seen a horse before 1519, yet within a generation they were riding with skills that left Spanish cavalrymen speechless. There are accounts from the 1560s of indigenous horsemen who could leap onto a running Mustang, guide it with knee pressure alone, and rope a bull while hanging upside down from the saddle. By 1570, something entirely new had emerged in the Central Valleys of Mexico, AST, the first true vaqueros. These weren't Spanish cattlemen adapting to Mexican conditions, and they weren't indigenous peoples simply copying European methods. They were something completely different, a fusion of ancient indigenous knowledge with Spanish livestock techniques that created a new way of understanding and controlling cattle. These early vaqueros developed insights that seem almost mystical today. They could read the mood of a bull by watching the dust patterns beneath its hooves. They understood that certain cloud formations would make cattle restless hours before a storm arrived. They learned to identify the lead animals in a herd not by size or aggression, but by subtle behavioral cues that Spanish overseers couldn't even see. The breakthrough tool that defined their craft was the riata, a 60-foot braided rawhide rope that became as much a part of a vaquero as his own right arm. But this wasn't just any rope. The construction required rawhide from specific parts of the bull, cut during certain seasons, braided with techniques that balanced flexibility with strength. A master craftsman might spend months creating a single riata, and the finished product could last a lifetime if properly maintained. The accuracy these men achieved with the riata defied belief. Spanish overseers wrote back to Spain describing vaqueros who could rope a running calf at 60 feet, loop the horns of a charging bull while their horse galloped in the opposite direction, or, and this is documented in multiple sources, catch a bird in flight to demonstrate their precision. But perhaps their most revolutionary innovation was in corral design. The Spanish had brought European concepts, APC, rectangular enclosures with rigid wooden fences that worked fine for docile European cattle in small numbers. But these structures collapsed like matchsticks when faced with hundreds of panicked Mexican longhorns weighing 1,500 pounds each. The indigenous vaqueros began experimenting with something completely different. They built the first curved corrals near Querétaro, using principles that seem to anticipate modern animal psychology. Instead of straight walls that cattle could see over and push against, they created flowing, circular designs that prevented the animals from finding focal points for their fear and aggression. The construction materials were just as revolutionary. Rather than rigid wooden planks that would shatter under pressure, they used interwoven mesquite branches that could flex and bend without breaking. These corrals could absorb the impact of a stampede and redirect the force harmlessly, like a martial artist using an opponent's momentum against them. The Spanish quickly recognized that they had stumbled onto something extraordinary. Men like Juan de Onate began recruiting indigenous vaqueros not as laborers, but as specialists whose knowledge was literally irreplaceable. The records from this period show a remarkable reversal, 2 Spanish landowners paying premium wages to indigenous horsemen whose grandfathers had been subjects of Montezuma. By the late 1500s, the first generation of master vaqueros had established techniques that would survive virtually unchanged for the next 4 centuries. They had discovered that cattle would follow a lead mare rather than a bull, that certain whistles pitched at specific frequencies could calm an entire nervous herd, and most importantly, that working with animal psychology was infinitely more effective than fighting against it. But this was just the beginning. In the 17th century, these techniques would evolve into something approaching high art, as vaqueros developed skills that seemed to defy the laws of physics themselves. The question is, how far could this mastery be pushed? The answer would astonish even the men who pioneered these methods. By 1700, something extraordinary had happened in the great haciendas of northern Mexico. The vaqueros had evolved beyond mere horsemen. They had become a distinct social class with their own customs, their own songs, and abilities that bordered on the supernatural. Think about this for a moment. We're talking about men who could gentle a wild mustang in 3 days using methods that seemed to defy every principle of horse training known to Europeans. Take the legendary techniques developed in the Chihuahua Highlands, where vaqueros like Joaquin Murrieta's grandfather, yes, that Murrieta family, could approach a completely feral horse and within 72 hours have it responding to voice commands alone. How did they do it? The Spanish chroniclers of the time were baffled. They described watching vaqueros who would sit motionless near a wild horse for hours, not moving, barely breathing, until somehow, and this is where it gets almost mystical, the animal would approach them. These weren't dominance techniques. These weren't the breaking methods used in Europe where you fought the horse's spirit into submission. This was something else entirely, a kind of psychological communication that incorporated indigenous understanding of animal behavior with an intuitive grasp of equine psychology that wouldn't be formally recognized until the 20th century. The annual rodeos of this golden age were spectacles that drew thousands of people from across New Spain. Picture the scene. Massive gatherings in places like Guadalajara and Monterrey, where vaqueros would demonstrate feats that challenged the very limits of what seemed physically possible. They would rope eagles in flight, not for sport, but to demonstrate a precision so absolute that they could control their riata to within inches at distances of 80 feet or more. But perhaps the most impressive demonstration was their ability to contain stampedes that would have destroyed ordinary facilities. A stampede, for those who haven't witnessed one, is basically a natural disaster with hooves. When 1,000 longhorns weighing 1,500 pounds each decide to run in the same direction, they generate the kinetic energy of a freight train. The sound alone, imagine continuous thunder mixed with the roar of an avalanche, could be heard for miles. European-style corrals simply couldn't handle this force. Rigid wooden structures would explode into splinters within seconds. But the vaqueros had developed something revolutionary, corral designs that used the animal's own momentum against them. The masterpiece of this innovation was built at the Hacienda de San Miguel in 1725. The designer was a vaquero engineer named José Antonio Navarro, and yes, I'm calling him an engineer because that's exactly what he was, even though he never attended a university or read a textbook on structural design. Navarro's corral utilized what we would now recognize as a spiral design that could hold 5,000 panicked cattle by redirecting their energy into harmless circular motion. The genius lay in the mathematics, 89, and make no mistake, This was sophisticated mathematics, even though it was intuitive, rather than formal. The gates were positioned at precisely 37-degree angles. Why 37 degrees? Because Navarro had discovered through years of experimentation that this angle created optimal flow patterns for cattle movement while preventing the formation of pressure points that could lead to structural failure. Modern computer simulations confirm that his calculations were essentially perfect. The posts were sunk 8 feet deep in patterns that distributed force according to principles that wouldn't be formally recognized in engineering until the late 19th century. Each post was positioned not just for structural integrity, but to create sightlines that guided cattle movement in predictable patterns. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. These corrals incorporated multiple levels of innovation simultaneously. There were the engineering principles, yes, but also religious and cultural elements that served practical purposes. Crosses were carved into gateposts not just for spiritual protection, but because the indigenous Vaqueros had discovered that cattle responded differently to posts with certain visual markers. Santos, carved saint figures, were placed in protective niches that also served as windbreaks and acoustic dampeners. The corrals were aligned with cardinal directions according to indigenous astronomical knowledge that took into account seasonal wind patterns, solar heating effects, and even the influence of lunar cycles on animal behavior. These weren't superstitions. They were empirical observations refined over generations into a comprehensive system of environmental management. The construction techniques themselves were marvels of practical engineering. Rather than using imported materials, the Vaqueros worked with local resources in ways that enhanced, rather than compromised, structural integrity. Mesquite posts were cut during specific lunar phases when the sap content was at its lowest, creating wood that was both harder and more flexible. Adobe foundations incorporated volcanic ash that created a concrete-like substance more durable than many modern materials. The corrals featured multiple interconnected sections that prevented the crushing force that could develop when too many animals were confined in a single space. The design included escape valves, controlled openings that would release pressure before it could build to dangerous levels. It was like a sophisticated hydraulic system, except instead of water pressure, they were managing the flow and force of living animals. The most innovative corrals included what we might call psychological features, design elements that worked with cattle psychology rather than against it. Curved walls prevented the animals from seeing escape routes that they couldn't actually use, reducing panic and the urge to charge. The walls were high enough to contain the cattle, but low enough to avoid creating the claustrophobic conditions that could trigger mass hysteria. Master builders like Navarro developed construction principles that sound almost philosophical. They understood that a corral wasn't just a container, it was a dynamic system that had to work in harmony with animal behavior, environmental conditions, and human needs simultaneously. The best corrals could function effectively whether they held 50 calm cattle or 5,000 panicked longhorns during a thunderstorm. By the mid-1700s, the reputation of Mexican vaqueros had spread far beyond New Spain. Spanish colonial administrators were sending detailed reports back to Madrid, describing techniques that surpassed anything known in Europe. French explorers traveling through Texas wrote accounts of witnessing corral systems that seemed to violate basic principles of physics. But this golden age was about to encounter something that would test every principle, every technique, and every tradition the vaqueros had developed. American settlers were moving west, bringing with them their own ideas about cattle management, their own cultural assumptions, and their own technological solutions. The collision between these two worlds would create something entirely new. But first, it would create considerable conflict. The 1830s brought a cultural collision that would reshape the American frontier in ways that most history books completely overlook. When American settlers first encountered vaquero cattle operations, their initial reaction was a mixture of amazement and dismissive arrogance that perfectly captures the complexity of cultural exchange on the borderlands. Stephen F. Austin's first encounter with vaquero methods in 1834 is documented in a letter to his sister that reads like a confession of complete intellectual humility. Austin, remember, was no frontier amateur, 23. He was the architect of Anglo settlement in Texas, a man who prided himself on practical knowledge and efficient methods. Yet, after witnessing Vaqueros manage a stampede that destroyed his own corrals while leaving theirs completely intact, he wrote, "These Mexican horsemen possess knowledge that would take us 50 years to acquire through trial and error." But here's what makes this story fascinating. The initial American response wasn't immediate conversion. It was skepticism, bordering on ridicule. American settlers looked at vaquero methods and saw what they interpreted as primitive, inefficient techniques that relied too heavily on individual skill rather than systematic engineering. The Americans brought their own approach to cattle management, SAO, an approach rooted in European agricultural traditions adapted for frontier conditions. They built rectangular corrals with straight wooden fences, designed according to principles that emphasized standardization, cost efficiency, and rapid construction. These were practical men dealing with practical problems, and they couldn't understand why anyone would spend months building curved corrals with elaborate design features when you could construct a functional enclosure in a matter of days. The moment of revelation almost always came during stampedes. Picture this scene. A thunderstorm rolls across the Texas plains, lightning splits the sky, and suddenly 2,000 longhorns decide they need to be somewhere else immediately. The American-built corrals, constructed with rigid posts and straight planks, would collapse like matchsticks under the crushing force. But the vaquero corrals, with their flowing curves and flexible construction, would channel that same force into harmless circular motion. Juan Seguin's Vaqueros provided perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of this principle for Sam Houston's men during the tense months before the Texas Revolution. A massive storm had triggered a stampede involving over 1,000 head of cattle. The American settlers watched in horror as their own facilities were reduced to splinters within minutes. But Seguin's corrals not only contained the panic, ISFE, they actually seemed to calm the animals through their design alone. The explanation lay in principles that wouldn't be formally understood until the development of modern animal psychology. The curved walls prevented the cattle from seeing escape routes, reducing their panic response. The flexible construction absorbed and redirected force rather than resisting it. Most importantly, the design worked with cattle instincts rather than against them. The knowledge transfer that followed was gradual and often reluctant. American pride clashed with practical necessity, creating a complex dynamic where settlers needed vaquero expertise but struggled to acknowledge their own ignorance. The breakthrough came after the Mexican-American War, when economic pressures overcame cultural prejudices. Vaqueros like Nicolas Martinez found themselves in an unprecedented position. Martinez had worked Mexican ranches for 20 years. When he was hired by Richard King to help establish what would become the legendary King Ranch, the Americans weren't just hiring Martinez as a laborer, they were essentially admitting that their own methods were inadequate for the scale and conditions of South Texas ranching. But Martinez and other vaqueros quickly discovered that teaching Americans required more than just demonstrating techniques. It required explaining an entire philosophy of animal management that was fundamentally different from European approaches. American cattlemen wanted step-by-step procedures they could systematize and teach to hired hands. Vaqueros worked from intuitive understanding developed over generations of experiential learning. The cultural exchange went both ways, and it wasn't always smooth. Vaqueros were initially amazed, and not in a good way, by American methods. The straight fences that invited destruction, the rigid structures that fought against natural forces rather than working with them, the complete disregard for environmental factors like wind patterns and solar heating effects. One vaquero, speaking through an interpreter to a group of American ranchers, reportedly said, "You build as if the land and the cattle are your enemies. We build as if they are partners in the same enterprise." That philosophical difference explains why the integration of techniques took decades rather than years. Richard King's decision in 1854 to hire entire vaquero families from Tamaulipas was revolutionary precisely because it recognized that this knowledge couldn't be separated from its cultural context. King wasn't just hiring skilled workers, he was importing a complete system of knowledge that included master corral builders, expert horsemen, and craftsmen who understood the intricate relationships between animal behavior, environmental conditions, and structural design. These vaquero families brought secrets that had been refined over centuries. They knew why cedar posts needed to be cut during certain moon phases for maximum strength, AMS, because lunar cycles affected sap content, which determined wood density and flexibility. They understood how the scent of creosote bushes could calm agitated cattle, knowledge that came from generations of observing plant-animal interactions. They insisted that corral gates must allow clear views to the horizon because cattle needed to see escape routes even if they couldn't use them. The Americans gradually learned that vaquero techniques weren't just different, they were often superior. The traditional vaquero practice of building corrals that could withstand Gulf Coast hurricanes seemed like over-engineering until the first major storm proved that American-style construction simply couldn't handle the combination of 100-mile-per-hour winds and panicked livestock. But perhaps the most important lesson was philosophical. American ranchers had approached cattle management as a problem to be solved through technological dominance. The vaqueros had developed their methods around the idea of working in harmony with natural forces. When those philosophies merged, they created something entirely new, a uniquely American approach to ranching that combined vaquero wisdom with American innovation. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always welcomed by either side. Some American ranchers resented having to learn from people they considered their cultural inferiors. Some vaqueros worried that sharing their knowledge would diminish their unique value and status, but economic necessity and mutual respect gradually overcame these barriers. By the 1870s, the merger was essentially complete. American ranches across the Southwest were using corral designs developed by vaquero engineers, horse training techniques refined over generations of indigenous knowledge, and cattle management principles that balanced traditional wisdom with modern efficiency. The question is, what happened to all that accumulated knowledge as the frontier closed and the old ways gave way to industrial agriculture? The answer might surprise you. By 1900, something remarkable had happened across the American West. The vaquero influence on American ranching had become so profound, so thoroughly integrated, that virtually every successful cattle operation was using principles developed centuries earlier in the mountains and valleys of colonial Mexico. Consider the scale of this transformation. The XIT Ranch in Texas, T9 Ranch, at over 3 million acres, the largest fenced ranch in the world, was essentially a monument to vaquero engineering principles. The ranch's massive corral system could hold 800,000 cattle, using designs that traced directly back to blueprints drawn by vaquero families whose knowledge stretched back to the conquest period. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. When modern engineers finally began studying these historical structures in the late 20th century, they discovered that the vaqueros had been using principles that wouldn't be formally recognized in structural engineering until the 1950s. The University of Texas conducted a comprehensive analysis of surviving 19th-century corrals in 1987. What they found defied their expectations. These structures incorporated force distribution patterns that matched computer models for optimal stress management. The angles, the spacing, the materials, everything, had been calculated to work in harmony with natural forces in ways that seemed to anticipate modern engineering theory. The most dramatic example came from studying the wind resistance capabilities of traditional vaquero corral designs. Engineers discovered that the curved walls and flexible post systems could withstand wind loads that would destroy conventional rectangular structures. The secret lay in allowing controlled movement that dissipated force rather than concentrating it at failure points. But the vaquero legacy goes far beyond historical curiosity. Today, this tradition lives powerfully in both Mexico and the United States, maintained by families and institutions that understand its continuing value. In Mexico, the charro tradition represents the direct continuation of vaquero culture. These aren't historical reenactors or weekend hobbyists. These are working horsemen whose techniques remain virtually unchanged since the 1700s. The National School of Charros in Mexico City maintains training programs where young riders learn the same rope techniques, the same horse psychology, and the same corral construction methods their ancestors perfected 3 centuries ago. Watch a master charro work with a reata, and you're witnessing skills that connect directly to those original vaqueros who amazed Spanish conquistadors. The 60-foot braided rope moves like a living thing, controlled with precision that seems to defy physics. These men can still rope a running horse at 80 feet, still calm a panicked bull with voice commands alone, still read weather patterns and animal behavior with accuracy that impresses modern veterinarians. In South Texas, families like the Maldonados represent an unbroken chain of vaquero knowledge spanning 6 generations. The Maldonados have worked the same ranches since the 1840s, and their corral designs are still outperforming modern alternatives. When Hurricane Harvey struck the Texas coast in 2017, modern facilities across the region suffered catastrophic damage while century-old vaquero-designed corrals remained intact. The Maldonado family's approach to corral construction incorporates traditional materials and techniques that most contemporary builders have forgotten. They still cut mesquite posts during specific lunar phases, still use adobe foundations mixed with volcanic ash, still position gates according to prevailing wind patterns, but they've also adapted their methods to incorporate modern materials where they improve rather than compromise the traditional designs. Universities are now studying these traditional techniques with renewed interest. Texas A&M University's analysis of historical vaquero corrals revealed innovations in animal psychology that contemporary designers had completely overlooked. The research showed that cattle behavior in traditional corrals was measurably calmer than in modern facilities, leading to better weight gain, reduced injury rates, and lower stress indicators. The economic implications are significant. Ranchers who have returned to vaquero-inspired designs report reduced maintenance costs, lower livestock mortality, and improved handling efficiency. The structures last longer, require fewer repairs, and work more effectively under extreme weather conditions. Perhaps the most compelling testimony comes from ranchers who learned these lessons the hard way. In 2010, a Montana cattle operation lost over $2 million when a spring storm triggered a massive stampede that destroyed their modern high-tech facilities. The ranch's insurance investigator noted that a small section of corrals built in 1920 using traditional vaquero techniques had survived the same stampede without damage. The ranch owner, Jim Patterson, spent the next 2 years studying historical vaquero methods before rebuilding his operation. "They knew something we forgot in our rush to modernize," Patterson explained. "How to build with nature, not against it. My great-grandfather would have understood these principles instinctively, but somewhere along the way we convinced ourselves that newer automatically meant better." Patterson's rebuilt facility incorporates curved corral designs, flexible post systems, and multi-section layouts that redirect rather than resist animal force. The investment paid off during the severe winter storms of 2014 and 2015, when his facility operated normally while neighboring ranches suffered extensive damage. The technological applications extend beyond traditional ranching. Modern logistics companies are studying vaquero crowd control principles for designing more efficient shipping facilities. The techniques for managing livestock flow through complex corral systems, offer insights for optimizing human movement through airports, shopping centers, and urban transportation hubs. But perhaps the most important lesson from the vaquero legacy is philosophical. In our contemporary rush toward technological solutions, we often overlook the accumulated wisdom of traditional knowledge systems. The vaqueros developed their methods through centuries of careful observation, experimentation, and refinement. They understood that sustainable solutions must work in harmony with natural forces rather than attempting to dominate them. This principle applies far beyond cattle ranching. The vaquero approach to problem-solving, ISA, observing natural patterns, working with, rather than against environmental forces, building flexibility into systems rather than rigid control, offers valuable insights for contemporary challenges ranging from urban planning to environmental management. The story of the Vaqueros reminds us that innovation doesn't always mean abandoning traditional knowledge. Sometimes the most advanced solution is one that combines ancient wisdom with modern capabilities. The master corral builders of colonial Mexico created structures that still outperform contemporary alternatives because they understood something fundamental about the relationship between human engineering and natural forces. Today, as we face complex challenges that require both technological innovation and environmental sustainability, the Vaquero legacy offers a model for thinking about solutions that are both effective and enduring. The horsemen who first learned to work with, rather than against the forces of nature, created more than just better corrals. They created a way of understanding the world that remains as relevant today as it was 3 centuries ago. Their knowledge lives on, not as a historical curiosity, but as a continuing tradition that still has much to teach us about building for the future while respecting the wisdom of the past.